Let me start by again congratulating you on this excellent building. Um,
Thank you.
you have talked about being inspired by the vertical museums in New York and other places. But the obvious thing to me, I already mentioned it before earlier, was that here we have a black monolithic slab. And of course, you think of Mies van der Rohe. Was that also an inspiration or in your mind?
Yeah, I think that it's funny because when we mentioned the vertical museums of New York, I think inspiration is not the right word, because uh, I think we think architecture not kind of a thing that comes from inspiration. It's something that is like more kind of a problem solving. And when we look at the issue, the problem of doing a museum in a very urban plot, a very small plot, and you have to go higher, and then you start to think of what has been made already in this kind of how to solve that problem. So we look at New York museums as a not as an inspiration properly, but kind of a how to solve that issue and how to make it work. So
Yeah.
and then it was more like kind of a research part of the work. And regarding Mies, I think is more or less the same. We don't think as a priori thing, let's inspire on that kind of. Well, we have many options. We can go Corbusian or we can go Miesian. It's not like that. We start solving the problems and having all the restrictions of the site and all the legal constrictions and all of the program that is imposed and to be the best solution technically and also aesthetically. So this equation, a lot of things comes into mind. And at the end, the solution was, I would agree with you that the solution is very Miesian, but it was not an inspiration from the scratch.
Okay, well, fair enough. Obviously, the black color makes one think of Mies, and I wanted to ask you about that because it looks, at least from the photography, a very deep black. I'd be interested if you actually know what the figure is for the optical reflectance. Um, uh, and also how black absorbs heat, but but the screen reduces the thermal load on the building. How do those two factors reconcile? First of all, do you have a figure for how much light it reflects?
No, I don't have this number, this figure, but I have some images that I can send you that it shows that it's not a deep black at all. It's a kind of a gray, that,
Right.
especially in the photographs. But it changes a lot of the color regarding during day and depends on how the lights goes into the facade. So it's not as black as it looks in probably the photo you saw. But
Okay.
obviously is a kind of a dark hue of black, and it kind of is not a reflective surface. But
Yes.
it's made of a very thin aluminum sheet that is
Yes.
perforated and also folded. And this casts a shadow in the actual
Ah.
building. So
Ah.
it's like 20 or 30 centimeters off the real
Yes.
wall. So this is kind of a scheme, and being of a single aluminum sheet, the conductance of the aluminum is so high that it doesn't it absorbs light, but it doesn't keep the warm. It's the aluminum. It's not as steel or other materials that absorb and have this inertia of the heat. So actually, we ran a lot of
Tests.
energy efficiency tests, and works really well. Even though if it was reflective white, it will be probably less absorbent, but it's very effective.
Okay, and to a certain extent, there is convection between the metal screen and the building. So
Exactly. You have a lot
that's
of
a ventilation. Yeah.
super ventilated. So it doesn't, if it's amazing because you have some other parts that are exposed. If you touch it, it's amazing how the aluminum doesn't retain heat,
Yeah.
compared to other
Okay.
materials.
Ah, all right. That's interesting. I understand. Now, talking about the building that was there before, the Dumont Adams building, apartments, you reused some of that structure. Can you tell us about what you did with the old structure? And I think there's some elements of the old building, perhaps at the ground first floor, that are retained. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the story it's an interesting story because it's the story of São Paulo, actually. That is a city that was rebuilt constantly on top. We built on top of other buildings.
Yes.
So this is a typical situation here, and we have coexisting now because it was not completely demolished, the first building, but we worked over a structure that was already 2000s structure, because they already did a
Ah.
big intervention on the
Oh,
residential building when we started. And it was, maybe we can send you pictures of the state of the building before we started working, because it was a kind of a ruin of the residential building with a massive concrete structure beneath that.
yes,
And then yeah, the thing is that was a residential building from the late 40s,
yes,
and was kind of a luxury flats, big flats, 12 floors. And it was
yes.
already kind of a anachronic building, because at the same time they were building in Avenida Paulista very nice modernist buildings like Conjunto Nacional. So it was kind of a pastiche already, so I don't think it was a very valuable exemplar of architecture necessarily to be preserved, So this
I
was a
thought it
kind
looked
of a.
pretty good, actually. But anyway, it's gone now, of course. But is it not, just generally speaking, is it not good, especially on a great street like Avenida Paulista, to have different styles, different periods, different usages next to each other? That this produces urban variety and interest, as well as preserving heritage.
Yes, of course. And we have, unfortunately, we don't have many of the original houses that were there. As just a little of the very interesting constructions that were kept. Uh, but I think that there was the second point of that question for us is that this building was a building for a residential building, like with very low ceilings, with a lot of internal partitions and structures, and it
Yes.
was and the windows and all the configuration of the architecture is very inadequate for the program that we were seeking. It
Right.
was we had to have like big higher ceilings. We had to have a very open spaces to arrange exhibitions. We have a massive amount of people coming every day. So it was inappropriate in a way. So it will
Yeah.
be like an operation of keeping a facade as kind of as an illustration of an era, but completely transforming already the building.
Yeah.
But I'm saying that, but actually it was not an option for us, because when we started working on the building, it was already destroyed.
Right.
So I think probably if we had the opportunity to think about that, we probably will transform it a lot.
Yeah.
anyway. But it was not an option when we started,
No, I understand. I understand. So you couldn't have done something like Norman Foster did with the Hearst building in New York. You know, basically he just kept the facade and it's a big atrium and then there is the new skyscraper. You
And
couldn't
so in
do
this
that
sense,
even if you wanted.
we couldn't because it was not there anymore.
Yeah,
But I don't think that's necessarily have the interest that you mentioned before, to having a coexisting in an urban scenario, different buildings from different eras, because it will be kind of a shell only. It was kind of
right.
a fake,
Yes.
You have the image of a building, but not a real building, because it will be very interesting to have people living next to a museum. That would be interesting. And probably if you have mixed uh, social classes and all but it will be more like keeping an image of that.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if you know, I'll tell you quickly, but talking about another vertical museum, the Tate Gallery extension in London by Herzog and de Meuron, which is a great building, and it's right up against apartment blocks. And there has been years and years of legal battle,
I
which
knew
the
that
residents eventually won, that they were
the
being overlooked by the visitors.
and yeah, and the problem of the crib, because there was very big glasses
Yes,
apartments, right? Yeah,
that's right.
yeah.
That's right.
So it's that a problem that is a good problem, I think, to
Yeah,
deal with the coexistence, right? But
yeah.
in this sense, I think the building that we have is already kind of bringing diversity, bringing difference, bringing new programs to the avenue. It's kind of a very strong piece of a volume, a very strong object in
Yes,
that context
absolutely.
that differentiates from the corporate buildings that are next to it, and kinds of, I think it adds complexity to the urban environment as well. It's a different complexity, but it's not like more of the same.
Yeah, I understand. And I also have to ask very quickly about the great tree that was there on the Avenida. You know the one I'm talking about. A beautiful tree, as Donald Trump may say. And like, could you not have saved the tree?
Yeah, we could, but when we started, it was already dead, so it was not
Oh,
there. So
really?
people, yeah, it's very funny because I see that you follow all the things that were said here, and it's funny because when we started, was kind of a wow, nice tree we have here there, and then 3 years before we started doing the project, it was dead and was cut by the mayorship, the administration of the city, nothing to do
Ah,
with us. But we did a new spot for a big tree, and we have already a tree that is in storage, which is is a jatobá, which is a native tree from Brazil.
a
That in front of
Jacoba.
them is jatobá. Yeah,
Yep.
we have a very nice park where there is a bit of just a piece of a rainforest in the
Yes.
center of São Paulo. And we
Oh,
have some jatobá that is from a seed from there that will be planted in the same spot that it was the big tree that you mentioned.
oh, this
And
is very good news.
yeah, and we have this is from the scratch. We have this plan. So we didn't we is not there yet because we're still doing the works on the underground passage.
Okay.
So
Ah,
as
yes.
soon as it's finished, they will be there.
Ah, okay. Will the underground passage be completed this year?
Yes, in
Yeah.
October it will be open to the public.
Okay. Now, almost everything, not everything, but almost everything about the new structure is the new architecture is rectilinear. But I was intrigued by a beautiful concrete curving staircase inside. I think it connects galleries. Can you tell us about that and why you thought, hey, let's put in a curving staircase, not a straight staircase. Maybe it was just to save floor space.
No, it was not a functional reason. Uh, yes, we did a building that is pretty much rectilinear. Everything is it's kind of a prismatic volumes. It's much a lot of as the original museum from Lina. So we kept this kind of very, but it's also uh, kind of our heritage. I would say our background here. I worked a lot with Paulo Mendes da Rocha, and who's a very uh, important architect here,
Absolutely.
and we have this way of we were formed by him. You know, the way of thinking. It's very like that, and this kind of austerity in form is very much informed by our formation.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we did a kind of an homage to Paulo Mendes da Rocha because this staircase is a bit of a piece that he did sometimes in the past, in the 60s, in some houses. And we wanted to have a kind of a citation of this period of architecture that it's the same period of Lina Bardi's, but also
Yes.
it's our personal background.
Yeah, yeah. I met him once in Venice, and
Ah,
I was so excited that I couldn't say anything intelligent. I was just saying, "It's so wonderful to meet you." I think he thought I was a little bit mad, actually, but I'm so happy to have met him.
when he won the Golden Lion, probably.
Yeah, yes, that's
Yeah.
correct. Yeah, and I'd
I was
written
with him. Probably we met then because I was with him all the time because he was like quite old at the time, and he asked
yes,
me, "You have
yes,
to come. You have to come to help me with all this kind of fuss that is Venice." And it was a very nice trip. We
yeah,
probably
yeah.
met there.
Well, I was introduced to him by Elizabeth de Portzampark,
Ah, yeah, yeah,
who's Brazilian and
yeah,
a good architect, wife of Christian de Portzampark. Um,
yeah. We met.
of course, Paulo Mendes de Rocha had said previously that any extension of the museum it must highlight Lina Bo Bardi's architecture without competing with it. I imagine you feel you have achieved this, but maybe it does compete a little bit. Can you comment on that? You know, in the light of Paulo Mendes de Rocha's wish.
Yeah, we talked a lot about this project, and because I started working with him in '93, so it was like my whole life in contact with him. So uh, even if he said that specifically for that, this is kind of a way of thinking that we already shared, and I learned from him. And we talked a bit about this particular project as well, and obviously it was a huge influence. But I think that what we wanted to do is to do something that is kind of at the same time uh, sober in a way,
Yes,
with not a very
not not expressive and vivid.
yeah, kind of an abstraction. Let's say that's a
Yeah.
very uh, regular form that is kind
Yes.
of and is not very flashy, and you know it avoids the composition rules of openings and facades and traditional architectural features. In a way, detaches itself from this, and it kinds of brings a background to Lina's museum. But at the
Yes.
same time, the challenge was to create something that will have a character, you know, to
Yeah.
be part of the landscape as something that has its own presence, and it makes him visible. So this was, I think, was achieved, somehow
Yeah.
by doing this kind of very pure form that when you look at the two buildings together, it kind of relate to each other, but it's not something that it not brings all the attention to it. At the same time, detaches from the other buildings next to it. So I think it kind of worked in a way to deal with these two uh, dimensions of an intervention like that. To be silent and at the same time to say something.
Yes, I understand. Well, now we have covered all my questions, but can I ask one more? And it's a
Sure.
general question, and that is about the future of museums. Obviously, museums have changed a lot in the last 50 years or so from being very institutional places that were quite quiet and everything. And now they're big tourist attractions. They're putting on spectacular shows, and architects often create spectacular forms. We now have the new challenge that everyone's attention is directed by the internet and AI and everything. So museums have to react to that. Where do you see? How do you see the museum of the future? Um, because everything has changed so much from the traditional museum scenario.
Yeah, I think we are uh, really moving from a different kind of museums, like, but not it's not from the 19th on. It's not a very recent thing, but we don't know what's going to happen. I'm kind of curious about what's going to happen again with the artificial intelligence, because it will be a new, I don't know. I think we can think about some new situations based on the experience that we already have, but I think in 2 years will be completely different again. In that
Yes.
sense, I think what museums have and we try to do is to make some places that you can have uh, real interactions. And we did a space, for instance, that is meant to be a space for performative arts, not
Oh
only
yes.
visual arts. So
In Sao Paulo.
no, in this building we have
Oh right. Yeah.
the
In this building.
nine
Yeah.
the ninth floor is something that is able
Ah
to
yes. Yes. Yeah.
have performances, and the idea of gathering people. I think it's something that is it's a good way of thinking the function of the museum. To
Yeah,
have the
yeah,
real
expanding
experience
the
of
function
uh,
and bringing live activity and interaction in rather than
interactions
just
and
everything.
you can call that you can see that as a tourism thing, or an eventful, life, social life, which could be
Yes.
bad, but in a way to provide spaces for human interaction. I think is the main interest for me for this kind of public and collective spaces. In a
Yeah.
way, the way we approach that is that. Because of all this dynamic transformations of information and cultural and events, etc., the building should be able to be transformed also. So we
Yes, it
try
must
to
be
think
flexible.
we try to think as a very infrastructural way, in a very infrastructural way, and very simple space as a thing that can evolve and can be transformed. And we
Yes.
like to think that we already did a transformation of an existing structure, and we look forward to be transformed again and again in the future. So we like
Okay.
to do not think forms as a rigid, manifestation of an expression that it freezes in time, but maybe it's a container for new experiences and new special organizations. And we think because of that way of thinking, the formal result is also very infrastructural in a way.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. Okay, that's excellent. Well, unless there's anything you want to add, which we haven't covered, if you wanted to make any particular points, I'm very happy with all of that, and I thank you very much. Was there anything you wanted to add?
No, I think you covered a lot of issues and questions that arise in the last months, and thank you for the questions. It was a
Yeah.
pleasure.
Uh, 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 Again, congratulations on the museum, and I am so happy about the tree.
Yeah, you maybe will be the first of writing about that because nobody asked me that question, even though a lot of people said, ah, they took
Oh,
off so it's good. You have a
oh, okay.
you have good
Yeah.
news.
Well, I hope that you guys, through Manu, keep us informed about your future projects,
Surely do.
and I hope we'll be talking again, perhaps.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, Herbert. Bye bye.
Bye.
Ciao.